Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg, and this time we're back in Odesa with Zarina Zabrisky, regular correspondent for the Byline Times, and the Byline Times co-founder and executive editor, Peter Jukes, who is experiencing his first trip to Ukraine since the Euromaidan protests a decade ago. Peter, I'll catch up with you in a moment, but let's start with Zarina, because Zarina, Ukraine has turned the tables on Russia by launching a successful counter-invasion, which it says is to secure a buffer zone. Ukrainian forces are reported to have destroyed a third bridge in as many days in the border region of Kursk, disrupting Russian supply lines. I think it's fair to say nobody saw this coming.
That's right, Adrian. And I have been to the area very close to Kursk region in May, at the very end of May. At that time, there was a large group of the Russian troops right at the other side of what they call gray zone or buffer zone. And remember these words because they will come in a minute and it's important. And everybody was preparing for the Russian offensive in the Sumy region or the nearby Chernihiv region, which is to the north. But what actually happened and what nobody was thinking about, that group was moved to the other part of the front line, which of course we know is a very, very long front line. And most likely that group ended up in the Kharkov region. And that's where the Russians are not having any success. And they needed those troops there. And so what Ukrainians did, they figured out that this part is now not protected. And they used on August 6th, is the most important in the military operations, namely the element of surprise. It's a fundamental aspect of military strategy. And for that, of course, one thing that we often speak on your show is the operational security is critical because it's ensuring the success of surprise attacks. And they were very successful at that because nobody, and meaning nobody in Ukraine, nobody in Russia, and nobody in the West, no NATO, no allies, knew about that move. So on the morning of August 6th, the first groups of Ukrainian soldiers, and they were armed with heavy equipment, they crossed the Ukrainian-Russian border and entered what is known as Kursk Oblast or Kursk region. And it was the largest attack on Russian territory since World War II. And of course, this region is important too, because very close by, there's Kursk nuclear power plant. It's an important asset. And since then, for the last 10 days, the Ukrainian troops were moving smoothly, having very little obstacles on the way, taking on their way the settlements, installing the Ukrainian flags, and capturing quite a lot of prisoners of war. And by now they control somewhere around 1,500 square kilometers and about 80 settlements. We can't confirm or verify it at this moment, but about this time. And Zelensky said that the strategic goal of this offensive is to establish the buffer zone, or it's also known as gray zone, which I have mentioned in the beginning of this talk, and securing it to push the Russian troops away from Sumy Oblast to protect the population, which of course we often spoke about referring to the Kherson region. And here comes another similarity. The Ukrainians are also using the same river. It's the name of the river, same river, in a similar manner as they use the Dnipro River in the Kherson region, which is the natural obstacle. So at the moment, the Russians are at the edge of being trapped because on the one side, they have the Ukrainian troops and on the other side, they have the river. And their logistics chains are being destroyed by Ukrainians. And this is where the long-range weapons come in. And that's why the Ukrainians really need them at the moment. And that's where Zelensky's statement came the other night, that the West, and that includes the UK and two other unnamed countries, we presume the United States included, to give Ukraine the right to use the long-range weapons, including Storm Shadows, on the Russian territory. Because if they're able to destroy the logistics hubs, they will be ensuring and securing this large part of the Russian territory, which they later can negotiate, use as a leverage, and obviously distract a lot of Russian troops, because according to some analysts, the Russians need about 20,000 trained troops to get this land back. And for that, they will have to move the troops from the other side and other parts of the front line again. And that could release a southern front and will give an opportunity for Ukrainians to move on and finally liberate the left bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson region, which would be wonderful, or say in the Kharkiv region. Again, here comes the element of surprise, so we don't really know. There are a number of other aspects that I could go on for a while, but one important one that I will bring in, the morale. Morale is incredibly important and probably number one factor in gaining victory. And the Ukrainian morale was going down, exhausted. Ukrainian people were starting to feel, if not defeated, then very, very tired. And we see here the new breath, the inspiration, the joy. People are overwhelmed and feeling strong again. And was a genius move, really, even if just the morale, as far as morale is involved. Probably another one thing that I will bring in to conclude that is the role of drones, because we can see on this example that drones are really the warfare of the future, because at this buffer zone, the drones were used, and the UK comes in here as well, because just recently London accepted that, yes, British drones were used for this attack, but they didn't name the type or the model, and they keep the operational security on that. But the drones played a critical role in this success.
Yes, on the Storm Shadow missiles, these long-range missiles that are British-made, Zelensky wants authorization to use those deep into Russia. The UK, although it insists that its support for Ukraine is unstinting, and it's talked about the billions of pounds in aid that it continues to give, it's spoken with rather a forked tongue with relation to the Storm Shadow missiles. At one point, the UK said that it was up to Ukraine how it uses them, as long as it obeys international law. At other moments, it has said that it doesn't want Ukraine to use them because it fears being drawn into the conflict itself.
Yes, because despite you exactly right about the forked tongue, they had earlier declarations, but London has not yet allowed Ukraine to use the missiles. And the range is 250 kilometers, 150 miles to strike targets inside Russia. And so Storm Shadows were reportedly used, but that the Russian positions in occupied Ukrainian territories, including Crimea. So it all boils down to the permission of using the long-range weapon. And I'm afraid, Adrian, that it will be the same story which we see throughout the war, when here comes no, and then maybe, no, maybe, and this long, almost like courting goes on, and then it's too late. And yes, I think Zelensky is right pushing these demands and pushing for the long-range missiles, because they could change the whole course of the war. They will.
Peter, I mentioned right at the start that you're back in Odesa for the first time in a decade. You witnessed the Euromaidan protests, the protests that were pro-EU, pro-democracy a decade ago. How is Odesa now that the country is unfortunately at war?
So I was in Kiev. I've never been to Odessa before. So I'm comparing chalk and cheese. Odessa is a very different city to Kiev, a wonderful city, by the way, with a wonderful atmosphere and a wonderful people. I mean, what Zarina talks about morale is very, very important, because here's a modern city, surprisingly well-ordered and wealthy. There are signs of recent attacks. Building opposite one of the people we work with was blown up like 3 months ago, and they've just refurbished this apartment. There are signs of war, but they're not dominant, and there's no sense among the people of defeatism. I mean, weariness, I think Zarina makes a point of that. I think what is going on now is sort of strategically really quite a change. So back like 10 years ago, I remember people saying to me when I came back, oh, they're Nazis, or, oh, it's always part of Russia. And what's happened here, and Odessa is mainly a Russian-speaking city, is that particularly in the last 2-3 years, Ukrainians have found a very strong sense of identity. You can be Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, whatever your own ethnicity, lots of ethnicities in Ukraine, not all Slavic. This war has created a very strong sense of culture, of a kind of soft patriotism. It's not aggressive. And I think that is pretty indissoluble. In that way, Putin has forever lost this war, because if you recall, this 3-day strategy assumed there were a lot of Russian speakers somehow rise up in favor of the FSB and Putin. It didn't happen. There were attempts to do that. One of the really interesting things is that, yes, there is a question. Would this war have been over quicker had the West been more supportive in using long-range missiles in more aggression? And would have more lives been saved? And we're talking more Russian lives, soldiers' lives, as well as Ukrainian civilians, who are borne the main brunt of these attacks. And this goes back, and I remember talking, I won't name him because he's a Byline Times columnist, who sort of takes a different opinion to me about the Ukraine war. He said, and he'd say to me, Peter, the key thing is to stop nuclear war. Right? So a lot of the caution that comes from Washington and London, and particularly Berlin, is this sense, the red lines, don't push Putin into nuclear war. This is the catastrophe which hang over our heads, nearly 80 years now, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Cold War. If we all step back now and think that 2.5 years ago, and all the strategies, if you look at all the war gaming, they said every war game that the Americans, the British, the French would all play, they do this, they sit and have these staff games. Immediately or very quickly, the war in Ukraine ends with nuclear escalation. The idea that Ukraine could invade Russia and take significant chunks of Kursk Oblast would have been inconceivable 2.5 years. Oh, that would surely cross a red line. Putin would have to launch nuclear war on that. And what we're realizing is that we've made decades of strategizing about Cold War and then to the standoff of nuclear weapons in the last 20, 30 years since the Soviet Union fell has been pretty meaningless. And the chances had been reined in by India and China of Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon or any kind of nuclear weapon to clear Kursk Oblast. So I think it's a brilliant strategic move for that reason. It makes us realize that there was a lot of nuclear saber rattling going on. And a lot of us have lived, especially my generation, in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, in this, that you freeze conflicts. Don't poke the bear. Now, the bear's been severely poked and collapsed and run away. If you look at how stretched, it's got a vast army, Russia, how stretched it is. It's very good at electronic warfare. That's one of the reasons, particularly Kherson down in the south is suffering, because they're very good at jamming. There's a sort of war game going on, arms race over jamming technology, over drones. But if you look at their organization and their supply, it's old school, it's railways, it's manually held pallets, unloading, and they're doing well in Donetsk because they have this massive firepower, this massive amount of artillery, some of it coming from North Korea. But when combined arms, because this is various drones, as Zarina makes the point, what they basically realized, the software in the drones in Kursk Oblast was old software, and they could jam it and they could get an advantage and then invade. Also, they're moving very fast on the ground. They have combined arms in a way, rapid maneuver we've not seen from the Russians. And then you have them occupying this major railway terminal, which gives them access to all the software of the Russian railways. I think we're going to see something similar here with the inability, though there have been innovations in Russia in technology, of the supply side maintaining, be able to move people to Kursk, and that will continue. And I think that way round, though you can see why Zelensky is appealing for long-range missiles, as every red line falls, that will encourage the West that it's not so dangerous, and that we could be at the point where we're pushing the Russian logistics to the point of crumbling.
Yeah, although I don't think we can ignore either that there have been Russian advances in other parts of Ukraine. Yeah. The Donetsk region, they've captured a town called Artemovo. You'll correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. They're looking to gain a town called Pokrovsk, which has been seen as a major distribution center for Ukrainian military supplies, and they are advancing towards that city. So although clearly Ukraine took Russia by surprise with its counter incursion, it is by no means all one-way traffic at the moment, and Ukraine is suffering civilian casualties.
You're definitely right, but the speed, Ukrainians have captured more land in 10 days than Russian might has in a year. On that attritional warfare, the Russians, they basically go and pummel a town with glide bombs. They basically destroy, turn a city into rubble and move forward. We're seeing a very different kind of warfare in Kursk, and it isn't the same as the sort of organized mobile warfare that the Ukrainians are showing on Russian soil.
Yes, absolutely, Peter, Adrian. What we have on the Russian side, they continue to use the scorched earth strategy in Donetsk region, as well as in Kharkov region, where both they are trying to advance and they are succeeding, unfortunately, in the Donetsk Oblast. And I've been several times to the town of Pokrovsk. When we're talking about these places, we have to understand these are not large cities. Sometimes they pass taking over small villages a major tactical and strategic success. And it's not true. But when we are talking about Pokrovsk or Terezk, that's indeed a significant advancement for them and a loss for Ukrainians, because like you said, Pokrovsk is a big logistics hub, and that the war is all about logistics hubs. Again, I want to bring in Kherson, because whenever the analysis is going on, it's never being covered, and it's important. It's a strategically important region in the south of Ukraine, and right now, what's happening there is unprecedented. The Russians are using drones, as we have discussed in this show, as the major weapon at the moment, along with artillery. The artillery shelling, tanks, mortars continue because Russians are located very close. And that again brings us back to Sumy, Kursk Oblast. Whenever there is a border, there is a gray zone, the region. It is different in Kherson region because the gray zone is the river and whatever is the coastal area along the river. But they are using scorched earth, and now they added the drone strategy, the drone assaults, when the drones are first taking down the water supplies by striking generators, diesel generators, and critical infrastructure and power hubs. And then they drop the napalm-like substance to set residential areas on fire. And then the first responders cannot come, the fire engines cannot come, ambulances cannot come, and we have the whole villages and the whole suburbs area burnt down, houses by houses, streets by streets. So they are turning the gray zone into ruins. And that we have seen in the Donetsk region, we have seen it in Bakhmut, we have seen it in Chasiv Yar, we've seen it Avdiivka. I'm sure you've seen somewhere those horrifying footage from drones where you see this just gray ruins, what looks like Dresden from World War II, really. And that's scorched earth for you. And that's what is happening right now in the Kherson region as well, where 50 settlements are now have been asked to do mandatory evacuation. So all along the front line, war is continuing, and it's continued at different pace and a different way. And in a way, we are getting a distorted picture because all eyes are on Kursk, and everybody and their mother, forgive me, wants to go there and film there. And all these other frontline parts that are equally important are being somewhat forgotten, rather other than Donetsk region maybe. But it is critically important for anybody who wants to understand the war to keep the big picture in mind, because the war is really the whole country and rather the global community being involved, because we also must remember that we all live in the time before the US elections. And I'm not saying this just because I'm an American citizen. I'm saying this because the timing for this offensive for Ukraine is also tied up to the American politics. You know, there are even some suggestions, I don't know if it's true, it's a speculation, that Ukrainians saw, let's say, somewhat of a weakness in the American leadership now, with Biden stepping down from the election campaign and Harris being preoccupied with her campaign starting. And there was sort of a vacuum where they decided, and somebody said it actually on air from the Ukrainian government, that act first, apologize later. There are other suggestions that the Ukrainians were looking at the Israeli and saying, oh, you know, like if they could do it and get away with it, you know, maybe we will do that as well. So it's really not just one isolated Kursk Oblast movement. It's the whole network, the whole novel of the world, if you will. It's a war and peace saga, which we need to look that way. And it makes it actually more realistic, more interesting too.
Yeah, although terrifying and tragic as well, of course, for the people involved. And Peter, I wonder, we can only speculate what Russians are making of this. They were guaranteed an easy victory against what they were told were Nazis in Ukraine. It's proved to be anything but an easy victory. Many thousands of Russian troops have been injured and killed, and now there are attacks within Russia itself. And of course, you had the attempted coup, or it may have been an attempted coup by Prigozhin last year, and this march on Moscow, which Putin stopped and negotiated with Prigozhin before Prigozhin's sudden death. Strange that. Do we have any sense that this will destabilize Putin?
I think this is very important, this war and peace narrative, which Zarina so brilliantly sketches out. And stepping back, look what happens to civilians in Kursk. They're on film saying, we didn't like Putin, we don't trust him, and welcoming Ukrainian soldiers. And look at those villages, they are not destroyed. Ultimately, Putin controls through ignorance and fear. I mean, you have very highly disinformation warfare in all its media. People are not told the truth. And it is society, as you can see from the fate of Prigozhin or Nemtsov or Navalny, on fear and death. That is quite a fragile thing, because once you cease to fear the dictator or the FSB or whoever's in control, as we've seen with many dictatorships, they collapse very rapidly. The difference is in this bigger narrative, and I can feel it here, is that every Ukrainian is motivated. I mean, some may be lazier, more cynical than the others, have their own complaints, but they very much feel they're participating in this conflict for their own lives and their own identity. You can see, by the way, mobilization, the punishment squads. I think there was a video recently where Ukrainian troops liberated Russian troops have been locked up and punished. They get tied to trees. In the long run of epic narratives, one is a stronger story and one is more likely a victory. The cost to get there, who would have thought this war would have gone on this long? How many people? And we're talking, you said thousands of Russian troops have been injured and killed, hundreds of thousands, Adrian. And we don't really know the Ukrainian casualties. But I was thinking, it's inconceivable. Odessa, where I am now, was going to be subject to an amphibious invasion in that lightning strike of 3 days, which Putin originally planned back in 2022. It is inconceivable that Putin would be able to control these people. And my suspicion is that once Russians get a taste of freedom, once Russians realize, when they invaded Ukraine, they couldn't believe how much wealthier it was. They all had inside toilets. Part of the anger in Bucha and Irpin was these Russians had been sold a lie, and they thought they were the kings of the world. They see they live in much more poverty. It may take a year or so, but the forces in this war and peace story, I think in the long run, winners are inevitable, and that's Ukraine and Europe.
Well, good luck to you both. I look forward to hearing further dispatches. Peter Jukes and Zarina Zabrisky. Before I go, just to remind you that the Byline podcast sits amongst a glittering array of audio offerings at bylineaudio.com. We've got Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson, which is very funny, myth-busting, very informative as well. We've got Travel Through Americana with Bonnie Greer and Hardit Matharo. So do check out bylineaudio.com. And if you take out the premium offering, you get all sorts of extra audio that you can't get on the free version, including an ad-free version of this podcast. So what are you waiting for? Head over to bylineaudio.com. Many thanks to you, Peter. Thank you to Zarina in Odessa. We'll catch up with you soon. Take care now. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Byline.